Hi, everyone, and welcome again to our webinar on notifying of a security breach. We're going to go through a case study today utilizing the Blackbaud security breach to discuss the roles of IT and the roles of security personnel in a breach like this. We're going to talk about Blackbaud and how they notified, the role of ransomware in that attack, and how to prepare yourself for an event like this. Just a quick disclaimer, this is not legal advice. If you were affected by this breach and are seeking legal help, contact a law firm. So just to catch everybody up on the Blackbaud security breach, for those of you who don't know, Blackbaud is a pretty big provider of customer relationship management software. That means they put, customer details for donations, alumni, other things. They're pretty popular in the academic space. So if you went to a college or university, you may have heard about this if they use this software. The company basically had a ransomware attack and their database deleted. And they had paid to restore the database. They paid the attacker in Bitcoin, and that was somewhere around the February and May timeframe of 2019. They subsequently, after going through an investigation, notified their customers that basically are these schools and colleges and charities that they had a breach, and to notify their own constituents. A few months later, some people may have gotten an email about this breach explaining from their school what actions should be taken by not only yourself to protect your data, but also by the school in terms of disclosing to privacy offices. In August of 2019, there was a class action lawsuit filed against Blackbaud as a result of this breach. And so that's still being pursued in courts. But essentially, we're going to talk about some of the major things Blackbaud did to secure itself before the breach and how they notified of the breach. So first of all, when we hear the word ransomware, what can security and IT do to protect against an event like this, right? How are we going to be proactive? What are we going to monitor for? And how are we going to respond to an event like this are important key questions. And when you look at Blackbaud, their security program included some monitoring tools like event management. They did penetration tests to try to simulate these types of attacks. And they even advised their customers to implement multi-factor authentication so that, just losing a password wouldn't give an attacker access to the system. Despite all of this, the attacker still got access to the system and was able to remove a database, as well as obviously try to deploy some ransomware. And so, why didn't their defenses work? Well, these monitoring tools require personnel behind them. Antivirus and other prevention tools that will try to stop these software attacks are sometimes so well understood by attackers that they can gain access to a system for a very long period of time. That's why when you hear them say it's sometime between May or February and May, you're kind of loose on that time that the individual had access. So we believe it's sometime in there because the attacker may have gained access for a prolonged period of time. To stop this, of course, we have to look beyond the antivirus or the firewall or things that will alert you that someone's in the system because they're kind of coming in under the radar. The difficulty in doing that, of course, is that you have to look at raw data, right? Most companies are not equipped to have, complex IT security programs like threat hunting in place to look at all the ways that, these attackers can bypass all the default security mechanisms. And so if nobody's setting off the alarm, you have this very long period of time, and you can see between February and May, the averages are correct, right? There is a prolonged period of time when the attacker has access to something and nobody's able to remove them because they're not able to detect them, giving them a very short period of time between deploying something like ransomware, deleting a database to actually react to the problem. And so if you want to know what you should do if you're attacked by ransomware or if information's lost, we have another great webinar called Breach Notification Myths Busted, where we'll not only give you a breach toolkit where you'll have templates, letters you can send to your constituents to let them know, but also a Rolodex of privacy offices and sort of explaining how to notify government institutions as well of that breach. So just to recap, the Blackbaud breach really, had some pretty, common tools in place, right? They had a SIM to look for logs. They had penetration testing. But even despite that, the attacker did, copy data and delete it, as well as try to deploy ransomware to their machines. They were effectively paid the ransom, so the attacker kind of got what they needed. And then even despite customer advisories around passwords or multi-factor authentication, there's a stronger role to play in monitoring and coverage of detection and response for the company to find these types of more advanced, sophisticated threats, right? Resources we have for you to help, obviously the webinar recording from the breach notification myths busted. We've also included a package in that other webinar in here to help you if you are trying to get ahead of a problem like this. We also have an IR guide, which will help you set yourself up to build the kind of policies and procedures to test this notification so you can be as fast as possible and not disappoint your customers like the class action lawsuit. So I've had a great conversation from an IT perspective with Bruno Petit. He is the director at Ridley College. And with over 20 years experience, he's familiar with not only the tools IT has to put in place, but the procedures, the relationships that you have to put in place in something like this. And so I've got a recording of that conversation that happened yesterday with him to sort of bounce around a few questions. We're going to talk about, obviously, how do you vet a cloud vendor like this? And when do you recommend doing that? You also have a number of helpful questions we ask about, before we, talk about a breach. What are the kinds of things you do to prepare? Talking about the timelines is very important. We want to make sure, especially in a breach like Blackbaud, if you're affected by it, you have the right capability to implement breach timelines. And so, being proactive is very important there. And it's good to understand how IT can prepare for that. We're also going to talk a little bit about the objectives in communicating to people affected by a breach, or how privacy can essentially play a role. Privacy regulation can play a role in how you notify, and what different kinds of companies of different sizes have to do to notify of a breach. So I'm going to jump into that other conversation with Bruno now, and here's a recording of that.
So I'll start you just by asking, when you look at a cloud vendor, and you must have several of them at this point, and you look at the due diligence, right? And how to do due diligence properly on a company. What are kind of some of the major things that you have to look for and focus on?
Sure. Well, Adam, one of the things is our strategy at the college is cloud first. So we all look at vendors that could sustain any type of software technology you want in the cloud. But I think what you have to do is you really have to do your due diligence. You have to go to market and make sure that you're sizing that software or that vendor software as a service that fits your company size and really fits your security practices. Also from a relationship-based perspective as well. But I think it's really important that when you're choosing a vendor that you're having conversations, not just with the sale, you're having conversations with their technical departments, the CISO, if that's available, asking information about what their security practices are, how often are they audited, what certifications they have, and really ask them not just verbally to send you that or tell you that they are, but to send you documentation that proves that they have these processes and governance in place.
That's a great point. I think, even as we look at something like Blackbaud, they're certainly, considered best in class, right? Like I would have rated their security posture as very high on the due diligence questionnaires that we ask from vendors, the ISO 27001s and the, best practices around penetration testing and log management, interviewing their CISO, as a sort of tier one vendor, these are the kinds of things that would happen to be in a due diligence questionnaire. So it is important to kind of stay on top of this. And one of the questions I had was, obviously you start a new position, right? Maybe there's a bunch of vendors there that weren't there before, for you at least anyway. And so how do you go back? I mean, you start a new position, you're new director to this environment. How do you comb over what was there before you?
And I think one important part about that is coming into any new position as a director or in leadership type of role, you've obviously inherited other people's decisions, whether they were good or bad. And unfortunately, in the situations that you will be breached, because it's going to happen, it's not if, but when you're going to be breached, everyone's going to be looking at you. So I think retroactively for myself is when you're coming into any environment, I think it's, even if you've been there for a while, Adam, I think it's really good practice on a biannually or annual basis to review all your vendors, check back in, see what their practices are. But we're actively going back and looking at other software as a services or cloud applications that were chosen and having those connections and making those relationships with the sales and their CISOs to understand what their security practices are.
That's a great point. I think, people also need to understand sometimes from a security perspective, you may not be able to switch. Like some people have had, you know, issues with things like LinkedIn or other types of major vendors, of which unfortunately there's, you know, not always another space to go to.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think about in some cases when you have such a large presence in a market space like Blackbaud or Microsoft or Salesforce, you do have to do the due diligence, and you need those relationships, because even after a breach, you're going to have to stay with them, right? You're going to have to focus on their practices even more. And so, you know, I think about the times when you inherit the role and you go back, and then I think about the times when, you know, times are tough and you do have to stick with it, right? You have to work with them as a partner. You know, I think about beforehand, right? Like we all want to be in a preparatory situation. We all want to be ready for something like this. And, you know, I think it's important as IT, how do you ask the right questions? Like, what do you focus on before a breach in terms of the kinds of questions you know, that you're asking, right? And how is that sort of managed?
So I think that's a great question. So I think for anyone that's maybe listening to this webinar, you know, if it's never happened to you, it's going to happen. And what you can do is start having those discussions with your CEO or CFO. And that's what I did initially coming to Ridley College. You want to understand a few things. You want to understand typically if your CFO has any type of cybersecurity insurance. What's that cover? What are we entitled to in the sense of we are breached, whether it be a vendor or internally? Who can we talk to? Because if you're, depending on your company and where you're located, you maybe have customers that are in the EU, the States, or Canada. And based on those jurisdictions, there's a lot of different things that you have to do. And you know, if you're in a specific state like North Dakota or Washington, you have to send them letters. Emails don't suffice as a notification if anything happens. So I would really look at it as saying, sit down, have the conversations, and understand what your tools or what you're missing from those tools, and really do like a risk mitigation exercise, and really get those contacts and almost doing an incident response management plan and having that already set in place. Because when it does happen, you really don't want to be scrambling for a subject matter expert like a VISO that we use from Intelligo or Adam himself, or you know, any lawyers. You want to be able just to call them, explain the situation, and they already have that relationship and understand your culture or your company.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's such a key part of this. If you think about Ridley, there's, you know, so many different places that the students can come from, that as an ecosystem with privacy laws, there's just, you know, so many different areas that you have to focus on. So it's part of that ecosystem, I think, to look at planning and making sure you have contact details. One of the things, obviously, we're trying to offer people that are watching this is just a Rolodex. Just trying to find out state to state, you know, province to province, you know, country to country in the EU. Who do you talk to? Who do you even notify? How did you notify? And you know, people are going to be out of their depth. So I think if they're trying to do this at the time, I think time is a great question that I want to focus on next. But when you look at just even something like getting in touch with people, not being prepared is such a high risk, right? It'll extend this time. It'll put you know, a lot of things at sort of a mad scramble. And I think people underestimate just how complex it is to fulfill things like notification and getting in touch with people. So that's awesome. We also had another shameless plug. We have another you know, guide that we help attach to these webinars that hopefully will get you in the planning stage for testing incident response early. Just how to write down, almost like poison control, just having those numbers at your disposal so that you're not caught and surprised and building all this in a horrible situation. The other thing I want to talk about is the timelines, right? Like when you think about the notification, it's such a short window. I mean, you have people, you know, in different areas with different, you know, timelines for requiring a breach. And if you look at something like in Blackbaud, you know, in the case notes for the class action, something about, you know, being notified very late. The user felt like they were notified very late. And I felt like for the people who were informed, you know, they informed quite early, but it's the total elapsed time, right? So, you know, what kinds of pressure are you under to disclose in a situation like this? Like how tight are these timelines?
So it's very good question, Adam. So, you know, in some jurisdictions, you have 45 days to actually respond back. But depending if you're dealing with the EU, that is cut down tremendously from 45 days. But the one thing that I think the pressure that any organization will feel is getting their message out before any media outlet or you know, security blog or they're at home watching the news at 11 o'clock at night and they hear it. So you're really trying to ensure that you have pushed out the message to your constituents, to your customers, before they hear from someone else.
Yeah, it really speaks to the idea that, if you're late on the news, it seems like you're not in the know, right? And that's not a great position to be in if we're talking about people's personal information, right? So that's interesting, and if you look at the elapsed time and how much each member would have gotten in that case, people's expectations are a lot higher than I think what any regulatory body would even say. So yeah, you got to be super fast. And I think if we think about communication, right, and the kinds of things that are going into these messages, I think obviously people put a lot of care into the letter, but they want to know certain things. So what are some of the objectives when you're communicating with these constituents? What are some of the highlights of what it is that you want to communicate back to them?
So I think there's a few things that we want to make sure that we do, and I kind of put this into 3 pillars, and that is really the technology, the reputation, and the relationship. And I think those are 3 different types of pillars, and to articulate those to your customer base is very important. I believe the technology piece is a large part of our component in our career, but we also have to understand the business components and understand that the constituents or your customers, you've chosen a tier 1 organization or product, and that your control and their trust is within that as well. But also you want to make sure that the relationship and the reputation of your organization does not suffer from someone else's mishaps. So it's very important to make sure when creating that message, it's clear, it's concise, it's understanding what areas or what the impact has on that individual, offering any type of services or further questions. So being quite open in the communications and sharing that quite freely, because usually when a breach happens, you're not in this small little microcosm. There's a lot of people using this, but we'd hate for another institution to notify one of our customers or constituents before we did.
Yeah, I think that's a great point with respect to the communication when an event like this could happen to somebody. I think smaller companies, they may even just be wondering the simple facts, right? Like, what should I put in a letter? What kind of institution should I be notifying? How and when should I be notifying? And to those individuals, I'd say take a look at some of the content, the previous webinar, certainly some of the materials, our breach notification kit, which includes a sample letter, includes the notification of offices, and helps you sort of template when you would notify in an incident response plan, so that you're just ready for one of these events, and therefore you're not working through your communication strategy amidst a scramble to make sure your customers are notified, right? I also think that there's some improvement there when you look at what might happen in a state to state regulation where things might change. You talked about sending a letter out in North Dakota versus potentially just notifying somebody online. I think that there's probably room for improvement on some of these standards to just sort of make it easy. There's always going to be information. I think about the college and other institutions. You've got people coming from everywhere, and their PII belongs where they were born and where they're filing their taxes. But you also have this concept that it's a mixed bag, right? It's everywhere, and so I think that as a constellation, it's a little difficult to help people manage. It's part of the reason I think we created that Rolodex. But when you look at the standardization, I think they could do a lot to help people. Maybe do something federal, right? I'm certainly thinking along the lines of what may have happened in the EU. GDPR applies to every country within there, but they still have different notification offices and things that make it much more difficult if you've got multiple citizens, and data repositories there. So I think they could do a lot to make it kind of a central office that kind of fans out to these different places, proxying on their behalf or doing something to limit it. And I also think that there could be better clarification on things like fines, right? This was the whole goal of our last webinar, was that people were not in the know about when they were or when they weren't exposed to financial remuneration from things like this, or other areas where one state has a breach notification law that has a penalty, the other one doesn't. And so that, there's a lot of things they could do to make it easier for people to understand what the actual implications are. And especially, in the webinar last time, we were talking about, GDPR and trying to be enforced, on a Canadian institution. in a previous story with a company called Aggregate IQ. And it's just one of those things where people are sort of blown away that this is how it was all carried out. Like that there was respect for the privacy, but in some cases financial remuneration, in some cases not. So I think that this could use a little bit of reform. It could be easier. It definitely could make it easier to comply with it. That's for sure, and much more simple to understand and notify. I also want to talk a little bit about this because I feel like a security practice is also a function of your wallet size. I think that, this isn't free, right? This isn't, did you guys, this is a cost to the back office, and it honestly adds to the cost of services and things like that. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think the reason that many vendors, especially young up and coming cloud vendors or other people, are seen fairly, I'm going to say unfairly, when you're doing due diligence, because they don't have a lot of these programs in place. Even if necessarily they're not putting you at a greater risk than other vendors, there's a lot of trust given to the big guys here because of this. And so, I wanted to talk about, for companies that aren't as big. And you look at Blackbaud, they had companies, I'm sure, that were getting donations that were, Harvard, right? And they're going to have a massive IT department and, in-house counsel through the nose and, liaisons in other countries for legal advice. What about for a smaller, college? Like, how do you guys scale up those efforts? How are you dealing with, the legal services or the consulting or anything else that's, you got to have on the shelf and it's just not there. It's not, you don't have the daily requirement to keep those kinds of people on staff. How do you sort of build that up?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. So I think that's one of the big things that I think is important to organizations is creating that incident response plan and actually building those relationships outside of the organization. Most organizations that are SMBs are not going to be able to source security or these individuals and keep them as their employees on premise as well too. It's just a hot IT skill as well too. So for our whole plan is going out and sourcing out and finding and making strategic relationships with individuals like yourself and Telego and other individuals for specific educational spaces, and ensuring and using those resources, because we can't be all and everything to anyone. And as you mentioned, security is quite important, and you have to find that balance of how much the bottom line and how much your CFO is giving you to make sure that you're still keeping the environment secure. So I think where a lot of people feel hopeless is they think they have to bring this in-house, and I say, no, that's not. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here, Adam. There's a lot of great organizations that you can partner with and form these relations that can help you guide to it, because it's ever changing. It's changing daily, minute. With COVID as well in IT, as I mentioned to someone this morning, Adam, we've done more changes in the last 4 months than we've done in 2 years.
Yeah.
Because we're forced to change so quickly now. You don't have a choice. And I think to your point about some of these small, nimbler organizations that we do use, because they are nimble, they're smaller, they don't have the big cog and wheels as bigger organizations. I tend to do some due diligence in the way of going to a vendor and saying, who are your certified partners or APIs? So they've done their due diligence. They've made ensuring that the information connecting to them is secure and refined. So I just don't go out and say, we've built a custom API out of an organization. I really go to the player first and ask them, who are their vetted vendors, who's actually gone through and been certified for their APIs or anything. And I find that adds another level of security for us.
It's really good advice. Well, thanks so much, Bruno, for being here. I really appreciate your time today. And hopefully you guys can use some of the content that we've provided here to help yourselves. We've got the breach Rolodex to help you get in contact with those organizations if something needs to happen, and you can use that to essentially stay ahead of trying to get all that information yourself. We've also put out an incident response guide, which will hopefully get you to proactively do this. Just get ahead of the problems. You want to be in a good position to answer questions and to act quickly, because you're not going to
Adam, start it tomorrow, Adam. Tell him start it tomorrow.
Yeah, start tomorrow.
Yeah. Don't hold off.
Grab a coffee and start right now. But thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.